What is Dollar Gujarati?
How do Gujaratis do business?
What kind of businesses can you do in America?
How can you grow your business?
How do you get your first customer?
How can you raise funding?
When should you be frugal?
Can you start a business as an immigrant?
Why is sales important?
Where are all the investors?
Which is the correct model for your startup?
Find these answers and more in Season 2 of Dollar Gujarati.
Season 1 was all about the stories of successful Gujarati entrepreneurs in America. Season 2 is about getting actionable tips from young Gujarati startup founders. Every week, we dive deep into solving one business challenge in a TED Talk style. Let's dive into today's episode. Hey guys, today we have Rahim Fazal on our show. Rahim has a really interesting story. He started out as an entrepreneur when he was still in high school. At the age of 15, he started his first company, which within a year he sold for a couple of $1 million. And riding on that wave of success, he started his second company, which unfortunately failed. And so Rahim had to actually go back to school. He had to go back into the normal education pipeline that's there. But he'd already experienced a couple of entrepreneurial excitements. So he started his third company, which he grew to be a $1 billion company, and it was acquired by Oracle. And Rahim today runs SV Academy, which is a great boon for people who want to get into the tech industry but do not want to code. So, hi Rahim, and what are you going to teach us today?
First of all, thank you for having me. Thanks for the intro. I think there were a couple places where I wish I'd built $1 billion company. Not quite. We did well, but this is going to be the next one, which is what I'm here to talk about, and that is the importance of sales. A little bit about my background as an immigrant coming into the U.S., what my journey has looked like, and then I'm happy to take any other questions that could be helpful. Share all the lessons from all the mistakes that I've made along the way, because there have been way more mistakes than there have been successes, and that's usually where I feel like at this kind of place in my life, I've really learned a lot more from those mistakes than anything else. So that can be helpful. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, sure. So something that we're really interested in knowing is how you navigated your immigration situation. And considering today's environment, what would be like a good rule of thumb to think about immigration, whether it's worth it or not, and how do you decide to continue fighting it out in America versus going back to your country? And I mean, if you have entrepreneurial dreams, how worth it is it to go through the immigration struggle in America?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think there's kind of two dimensions for all of us that we have in common, I believe. One is, as Gujaratis, we have a pretty strong kind of immigrant journey and identity. And the other one is we, through that journey, have been quite industrious and enterprising in sort of figuring out how to, create something out of nothing. And so for me, kind of paying respect to that journey, my great-grandparents and grandparents were born in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad and Porbandar. And from there, the family went to East Africa, where there is actually a pretty large Gujarati community, and still is. And then as a result of some of the political upheaval that happened in the early 70s, we came to Canada. And then I was born in Canada. And now, as I you shared a little bit about my kind of, adolescence, as I got into kind of my early 20s, it was then my dream to come out here to the US and make yet another move, because we Gujaratis can't stay in one place for very long. And then now I have my own family. I have a little baby that just came about, and I'm kind of thinking about, all right, well, what will the next part of this journey be? And so it's been very fluid for me in my family history, and even in my life now. In terms of what the specific journey coming into the US was, and a good place to start, I think, is a thought process. So one, again, because of the journey and the enterprise, the kind of industriousness of our community, I wasn't too worried about coming to the US. I knew that I'd figure it out one way or the other. I think the more important piece was what was the motivation. And the motivation for me was when I was building these startups in Canada, I think whether I'm in Canada or where I would have been in East Africa or I would have been in Gujarat, I think it's not Silicon Valley. It's not the US. And so, my world felt very small. It felt like the minor leagues to like the major leagues. And I always wanted to go and do something in the major leagues, which is why I wanted to come here. And that had been a driving force for some time in my late teens and then in my early 20s. I had a chance to come down here when I was about 24. And like a lot of us, the hard part was I knew I could start something and I wasn't like I could figure out how to kind of sustain myself. The thing I didn't know how to do was navigate the immigration process. And it turned out to be pretty archaic. I think if anyone has any experience with the US immigration process, it's not very straightforward. For me, I had the benefit of being a Canadian citizen, Canadian born, where I could take advantage of the NAFTA process, which was the North American Free Trade Agreement, which allowed Canadians to come to the US for temporary work if there was a proof of employment. And so I through a series of events, I was coming, well, basically I had met a girl, we were dating, she was living in Palo Alto, I was coming back and forth to visit her. And as that was happening, I was also meeting her friends, kind of getting to know the lay of the land. And through friends of hers, I eventually met a startup that was started by a few Canadians that kind of had empathy for my situation and were willing to hire me. They were willing to hire me and do the work on getting my work authorization. And that was really how I was very lucky and very fortunate that they were willing to do that, because they didn't know who I was and no other employers were willing to really do that for me. And I tried to apply at Google and eBay, I remember, but I didn't get those jobs. They were very competitive to get those jobs. And even though I'd started a couple of companies in Canada, they didn't really seem to care about that. It wasn't like US experience, right? So I had this small startup that took a chance on me, worked out my employment and my work authorization. I came down, moved to Palo Alto, and just kind of started my journey here. And then I ended up, meeting up with at that job, I met somebody who wanted to start a company, and we kind of linked up together. And eventually I moved to an H-1B. I did a couple of H-1Bs, and then again, like, just so lucky that, like, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, I applied for a green card under the EB1 category, which is like this extraordinary alien category, and put together a good package, and I received, my change of status, and now I've applied for citizenship myself. Now that's sort of a long-winded kind of background on my own journey. I think the most important part of it was going back to the motivation. Like, why did I do this in the first place? And I did in the first place because I wanted to play in the major leagues, right? And I think if you are out there and you have a similar motivation, I think if I were to redo that decision today, I'm not quite sure I would take the same path, because it was a lot of hard work. It was really, it was tough to switch between all these different visas and different work authorizations and not really feel like I belonged for so long. And if I were to do it again, I think I could make the case that the major leagues exist in a lot of places around the world right now. And while Silicon Valley is still a very special place, I think there's ways that you can tap into Silicon Valley and its core assets today in ways that I could never have 10 plus years ago.
So if you were to be in a situation today that you are facing all these issues, and especially if you're Indian,
Yeah.
and the green card's going to take almost your entire lifetime. Is it really worth being in America today versus going back to India or say to Canada? So how would somebody go about thinking about this?
Yeah, I love this country, and I am kind of long-term bullish on the opportunity here, um, at least in our lifetimes. I think the challenges of today, as it relates to getting access to permanent residency, to citizenship, to basically establishing your roots here, are much more significant than they were when I came here and made the decision to do that work, and even more so than the generation prior. There's a large Indian diaspora here in the Bay Area, in tech communities all across the U.S. Many Indians came here in the 70s and then into the 80s. And then today, I feel it's so challenging that I'm not sure if I would be better off putting my time and energy into trying to navigate the immigration process, or I'd prefer just to kind of sit it out for a little bit and put that time and energy into building my company, because it is a distraction both in terms of real time as well as psychologically. And I think in this very moment, the cost is substantial, and it's worth really considering more seriously than perhaps I did.
Would you be willing to tell us more about EB1? Like what were the requirements for it, and how can one
Yeah.
apply for that?
Yeah. So with the first couple of work authorizations I received, I used a lawyer. I used a lawyer, but in a very lightweight way, just to basically for some guidance and then some review, just a few hours of work. When it came to the H-1B, I relied heavily on a lawyer. And when it came to the EB-1, I relied even more heavily. And so I think the first place to start is I chose somebody who was recommended to me by other folks who had received an EB-1 successfully by working with this individual. And so that was where I started. And I think that was the most important decision that I made. When I began working with this person, because he had had a lot of experience with this, he was able to very clearly map out the process for me and tell me what was most important, where I should spend the most time. Oh, and by the way, I should actually, before I even go into the detail, let me tell you about the timeline, right? So the timeline was about, from the time I met the lawyer to the time I received my green card, it must have been about a year. So not that long in today's terms. And even just to put even more kind of emphasis on that, the period of time between I submitted my application and I received my authorization for, I think, my EAD card was 5 months. So it was quite expeditious. And I think it's because the category of EB1 is, the funnel is more narrow, so there aren't as many applicants going down that path. And the requirements are pretty stringent. And so I think if there aren't a lot of people applying for it, the ones who are applying have spent a lot of time in making sure their application is ready and it's bulletproof the first time around, right? So that was a timeline. And then in terms of what was the hardest part of pulling it all together, it was a package of artifacts that essentially had to make the case that I was at sort of a world-class level in my field. And in my case, it was in social media marketing, which today, everything is social media marketing. But when I was pulling my application together, social media marketing was a new concept for businesses and for brands. And we were just a few years into brands getting on Facebook and Twitter. And so I was able to successfully qualify for that based on a number of external kind of pieces of validation. So for example, I'd won some awards like top 25 digital marketers in the US, top 30 under 30. I'd like received a couple of these things, and then I had a lot of my customers who worked at large brands like MTV, for example, Viacom, Nike, Rolling Stone magazine. I remember those were like 4. I think I had a lot. I think I picked 10 customers, and I went and I asked them, like, listen, I'm pulling this application together. Your reference letter would mean a lot. Like, do you mind helping me with it? And all of them said yes. And, we pulled all those letters together. We pulled all my kind of media clippings. We pulled all the awards, like every single thing I could think of, as far back as I could think of. And I must have had a stack of papers like this thick, because I just didn't want to take any chances that it wasn't going to work. What is the biggest learning that I had, right? Like on that, I would say is, if you're interested in the EB1, a good lawyer will tell you to define the category as specifically as possible. And so for me, with social media marketing, I knew it was a new industry. There weren't that many people who could claim to be, like world-class at doing it. If you are in the field of business, you have to think very clearly about what would it take for you to be at the very top of your category, and take the time to define that well, and make sure that you may even start first with what are the artifacts that I have, and then kind of shape the category based on that. In either case, the best thing to do is get some actual legal advice from a lawyer, as I mentioned at the beginning, because it doesn't hurt to even have a first conversation, so they can lay the land for you, and you can get an understanding of what it will really take. And they'll give you an opinion as well. Like, do they think that they could help you put this together? Because most good lawyers will not take the case unless they think they can be successful.
Do you mind giving your lawyer's name?
Yeah. So Ghoshal is the law firm. Malcolm Ghoshal is the partner.
All right. Thanks a lot, Rahim. Thanks for sharing your immigration story with us and answering some of our questions, helping us think through it. And I think that.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to say thank you. Thank you for having me, and tackling like a really important topic that I know is on a lot of people's minds right now.